Grizzly bears move with shocking speed and unmatched power, capable of turning a quiet moment into a fight for survival in seconds. These colossal creatures strike not out of curiosity, but driven by hunger or instinct, leaving devastation in their wake. In this video, we explore 6 harrowing bear encounters, from a family's summer retreat disrupted by a hungry grizzly to a circus performance that spirals into chaos. Prepare to hear gripping accounts of survival when nature's fiercest predator unleashes its deadly force, revealing the terrifying reality of human-wildlife conflict. The thick pine forests of Ussuri stretched endlessly in all directions, silent under the looming shadow of dusk. Deep in its heart, perched high on a crooked cedar, stood the modest treehouse where the Yelkov family had chosen to spend their summer break. It was a retreat intended to help them reconnect after years of city life had drawn them into separate routines. Each family member longed for peace, simplicity, and the wild beauty that Sergei, the father, had once known in his youth. Sergei, a rugged man in his late 40s with a background in forestry, had carefully planned the trip. He chose the treehouse cabin that his uncle and father had built together in their younger days. He believed the wooden platform, raised some 15 feet above the forest floor, would offer seclusion and a degree of protection, especially for his wife Irina and their 3 children. 16-year-old Pavel, 12-year-old Katya, and 10-year-old Mila. None of the children had spent more than a weekend in the wild, and the idea of a retreat among the treetops, far from city noise and routines, filled them with excitement. The treehouse, weathered by time but still sturdy, had a narrow ladder nailed into the trunk and a small trap door that could be locked from the inside. It was a nostalgic holdover from another era, a simpler, safer time. Yet no one could have predicted that this time, the deep woods held something far darker. Something not just wild, but desperate and driven by hunger. For several days, the family hiked and played, storing their simple meals, dried meat, bread and fruit, in a cooler tucked into the corner. Unknowingly, the scent drifted through the trees and underbrush, reaching the awareness of creatures that moved silently through the shadows. On the evening of June 11th, as the family settled into their sleeping bags and a light breeze stirred the treetops, a massive grizzly, its ribs faintly visible beneath a thick, scarred hide, caught the scent and began to approach, drawn by hunger and the prospect of easy food. This bear was not driven by curiosity, but by raw desperation. Just after midnight, its low growl echoed through the forest like thunder as it slammed its bulk against the ladder, breaking the lower rungs with a jarring impact. The entire treehouse shuddered, wood groaning, bolts creaking under the force. Inside, panic and confusion overtook the family. Sergei threw his weight against the trapdoor to keep it shut, while Irina pulled the children into the corner behind him, her limbs trembling and her eyes wide with disbelief. The bear, relentless and consumed by need, clawed up the broken remains of the ladder. Its massive paws dug into the bark as it reached the trapdoor, which Sergei held down with all the strength he could muster. But the bear was too strong. It crashed against the door until the aged hinges cracked and the wooden barrier splintered, hurling Sergei backward as the beast forced its way into the cramped space with a roar that shook the structure. Chaos erupted in an instant. The bear lunged at Sergei first, crushing him beneath its weight and mauling his chest and throat with horrifying efficiency. Blood sprayed across the walls and floor. Irina tried to shield the children, pushing them behind her as the bear turned toward her. With a single swipe, it delivered a fatal blow, leaving her lifeless as Katya slipped in the blood now pooling across the floorboards. Pavel, the eldest, grabbed a small hatchet they had brought for splitting firewood and tried to fight back. His blows landed, but were ineffective, barely slicing the bear's matted fur. The animal responded with a furious roar, clamping its jaws around the boy's shoulder and thrashing him violently. Bones cracked under the force. Katya tried to crawl past the beast, but it caught her, pinning her down and tearing into her back with its claws. Her body convulsed once before falling still beneath its massive form. In the midst of the horror, Mila, the youngest, had already hidden. Paralyzed with fear, she had crawled beneath a pile of coats and sleeping bags in the corner, curling into the smallest space she could find. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, her breath held as the sounds of destruction and death echoed around her. The bear, now soaked in blood and breathing heavily, paused. It turned its head as if sensing her presence, then resumed pacing, sniffing the air and searching the shattered cabin for more prey. For what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the bear prowled. Its claws clicked on the blood-slick wood as it circled, grunting and hunting. Mila remained motionless, frozen in a silent scream. Whether it was the overpowering scent of blood or a temporary satisfaction, the bear eventually turned and backed out of the trapdoor. It climbed down the cedar and disappeared into the shadows of the forest without finding her. The treehouse fell silent. Mila stayed still, curled in the corner, the trauma rendering her mute. As birds began to sing again and the first rays of dawn illuminated the wreckage, she whispered her sister's name. There was no reply, only the stillness of death and the soft creak of broken boards swaying in the breeze. Later that morning, a search team arrived from the nearest village. Friends had raised the alarm after the family failed to check in. The rescuers, rifles drawn, followed the trail of destruction through the forest. When they reached the ruined treehouse, they climbed the remnants of the ladder and opened what was left of the trapdoor. Inside, they found devastation, and in the corner, pale and barely conscious, Mila. She clutched her sister's blood-stained coat, the last connection to her family. In the aftermath, investigators concluded the bear's aggression likely stemmed from worsening environmental conditions. Reports of other incidents in the area supported this theory, though the tragedy left many grieving. Mila's survival emerged as a fragile yet powerful symbol. Her endurance amid unthinkable terror became a story not only of loss, but of resilience. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the memory of what she had endured, the sounds, the weight, the fury, and the unbearable silence that followed. The circus tent stood like a giant striped monument at the edge of the city, pulsing with music and bright lights as hundreds of people crowded inside. Laughter and anticipation filled the air while children tugged at their parents' sleeves, and performers in sequined costumes moved through the crowd, tossing candy and balloons. The ringmaster drew attention beneath the arched beams of the canvas roof, and in the center ring, under a spotlight of golden haze, a massive brown bear stood upright, balancing on its hind legs and turning slowly on a platform to delighted applause. The bear, nearly 7 feet tall and weighing over 600 pounds, was the grand finale of the night, a spectacle that drew families from across the region. Children stared with wide eyes as the towering animal, clad in a loose red collar and guided by 2 handlers with long poles and treats, moved through a routine of rehearsed gestures, standing, bowing, and spinning. Each movement appeared stiff but controlled, the illusion of discipline held together only by training and familiarity. Unseen beneath the surface, however, a quiet unease stirred within the animal. In the front row, a boy named Lucas, 8 years old with a round face and tousled brown hair, sat beside his mother and younger sister. Clutching a box of popcorn, he leaned forward, entranced by the towering bear. Its thick fur gleamed under the lights, and clouds of breath escaped its mouth despite the warmth inside the tent. The handlers barked commands and waved treats to maintain the act, yet something seemed off. A stiffness in the bear's frame, a twitch in its eye, subtle signs of growing distress unnoticed by most. Without warning, everything changed. The bear halted mid-step, abruptly turned toward the edge of the ring, and with a deep, guttural sound that sliced through music and chatter, it lunged forward. Whether the leash snapped or slipped from the handler's grasp was unclear, but the creature broke through the low barrier with terrifying speed and force, closing the gap between performer and audience in seconds. Panic erupted. Screams rang out as spectators bolted from their seats, toppling chairs and spilling food. The bear had already locked eyes on Lucas, who sat frozen in fear as the enormous creature reared up before him. With one swipe of its paw, it sent the popcorn flying. A moment later, its jaws clamped around the boy's small arm. Lucas was yanked partly from his seat in a single jolt, pain surging through him as his mother tried to reach him. She was pushed back by the stampede of the fleeing crowd. The bear shook the boy with violent force, its teeth sinking deep. Blood soaked Lucas's shirt as chaos spread. The handlers raced into action, shouting, tossing meat, and trying to draw the animal's attention. Lucas remained in the bear's grip, his body jerking with each movement as panic overtook the tent. His cries were swallowed by the noise and confusion. A metal pole jabbed into the bear's side, not hard enough to harm, but enough to startle it. The animal growled, blood on its mouth, and hesitated. Yet instead of releasing the child, it clamped down harder. More handlers rushed in, forming a wide arc, shouting, clanging tools, and creating as much commotion as possible to distract the animal. After moments that felt like an eternity, the bear dropped Lucas. The boy collapsed, limp and bloodied. As the bear turned to swipe at a nearby trainer, two men rushed in and pulled Lucas out of reach. The team surrounded the animal, forcing it back toward the ring. Reinforced gates slammed shut behind it, locking the creature away once more. Lucas was carried to the exit, pale and barely conscious, his arm badly injured. Medics arrived swiftly and placed him in an ambulance as onlookers gathered outside. Sirens echoed into the night while news of the incident spread quickly. The circus grounds dissolved into flashing lights, sobbing parents, and urgent questions. At the hospital, surgeons worked into the early morning. They managed to save the arm, though the damage was extensive. Doctors warned of a long recovery, both physical and emotional. Though Lucas survived, the experience, the image of the bear, the sounds of terror, the helplessness, left deep marks on everyone present that night. The aftermath brought swift consequences. The circus faced immediate scrutiny. Safety measures, licensing, and the use of wild animals in performance came under harsh review from local authorities and animal welfare groups. Within days, multiple shows were canceled, and an investigation was launched. The public response was intense, and discussions around legislation banning the use of wild animals in entertainment gained traction. In time, Lucas began to recover, though the journey ahead remained difficult. The memory of that night, the noise, the power of the animal, and the confusion would remain with him and those around him for years. The spectacle that had once drawn awe and excitement now stood as a symbol of the unpredictable dangers lurking beneath the surface of human-controlled displays. For many, it marked the beginning of a long overdue conversation about the ethics of wild animals in captivity and the responsibilities owed to both the creatures and the people placed so close to them. The night air in the remote wilderness of British Columbia was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but within a small, quiet campground nestled between towering evergreens, the peace was on the verge of being shattered by a terrifying force of nature. Karen, a woman in her early 40s who had ventured into the forest seeking solitude and adventure, was resting inside her luxury SUV after a long day of hiking. She had parked beneath a dense canopy of trees, taking care to set up camp carefully and enjoy the stillness. The vehicle was stocked with food, most of it packed in sealed containers and bags, but the lingering aroma inside was enough to attract a presence neither expected nor wanted. As Karen drifted into a light sleep, a sudden crash of breaking glass and heavy thuds against the vehicle's metal frame jolted her awake, snapping her from dream state to raw terror in a heartbeat. In a matter of seconds, a massive grizzly bear had smashed through the windshield, sending shards of glass across the seats and dashboard. The bear's immense bulk pressed against the shattered window frame, its claws raking deep gouges into the leather and plastic interior as it clawed and bit with frantic force. Drawn by hunger and frustrated by the scent of food just out of reach, the bear displayed aggressive behavior driven by desperation. It showed no hesitation as it tore through the fragile barrier between itself and Karen. Trapped in the confined space, Karen was pinned against the seat by the animal's enormous head and powerful forelimbs as it reached through the broken window, swiping at her with claws that cut like knives. Pain erupted in her right arm as the claws dug deep into muscle and flesh, leaving burning wounds that bled freely onto the torn fabric of her jacket. Despite the shock and agony, her mind remained focused. Panic threatened to take hold, but she fought to remain calm, knowing that losing control could mean losing everything. The bear's hot breath filled the interior, accompanied by the sounds of glass crunching under its weight and the crack of plastic yielding to brute strength. Each violent movement of the animal was a reminder of her imminent danger. With trembling hands, she reached for the door lock, her fingers slick with blood yet determined to escape. At first, the door resisted, its frame twisted from the bear's attack, but after several agonizing seconds it gave way. Karen pushed it open, wincing as the bear's claws brushed her arm once more. The moment she was free, she crawled onto the muddy ground, scrambling backward through the dirt and pine needles, her voice rising in a raw, desperate cry for help. The bear advanced for a moment, snarling, but was soon distracted by the sudden eruption of sound and light from nearby campers who had heard the commotion. The once quiet campground became a frenzy of action. Metal pots banged loudly, bear spray hissed through the air, and voices called out urgent warnings. Campers acted quickly, defending themselves and diverting the bear's attention away from Karen. Confused and agitated by the assault of noise and light, the bear growled in protest, but gradually began to back away. It limped slightly, a possible result of its own violent encounter with the vehicle, and retreated into the shadowy forest, vanishing into the thick underbrush. Nearby campers rushed to Karen's side as she collapsed, clutching her injured arm and trembling in the wake of the attack. Her wounds were serious, but thanks to the quick response of others, she had survived what could have been a fatal encounter. Emergency responders arrived within the hour and transported her to the nearest medical facility. There, surgeons worked to clean and treat the deep gashes and puncture wounds, stitching torn skin and muscle, and administering antibiotics to prevent infection. The physical damage was extensive, but her ability to remain composed in the moment had been vital in minimizing the consequences. Recovery would be long and painful, both physically and emotionally, as the memories of that night clung to her mind like scars. In the aftermath, word of the attack spread swiftly through local outdoor communities and regional wilderness authorities. Advisories were issued, urging campers and hikers to adopt stricter precautions when storing food and managing campsites. Officials highlighted a growing concern. Grizzly bears were venturing closer to human settlements in search of food, driven by habitat loss and seasonal scarcity. As natural food sources declined, these animals were becoming increasingly bold and dangerous. The incident served as a stark warning. Even in well-maintained wilderness areas, the balance between human activity and wildlife could tip dramatically with little notice. Authorities reiterated the need for bear-proof storage containers, suspended food caches, and vigilant campsite hygiene. Leaving food or packaging unattended, even inside vehicles, could result in dire consequences. Campers were cautioned to avoid preparing or eating food near sleeping areas and to remain alert, especially in regions with recent bear sightings. Wildlife experts examining the event observed that the bear's behavior aligned with that of an animal driven by extreme hunger rather than typical aggression. It was noted that bears conditioned to associate human spaces with food gradually lose their natural caution, increasing the likelihood of violent interactions. They warned that without intervention and improved coexistence strategies, these situations would only become more common. Karen's ordeal became the subject of study among park officials and wildlife biologists, who cited her case as an example of escalating human-wildlife conflict. Her SUV, now badly damaged and littered with claw marks and broken glass, stood as a physical reminder of the night's terror. Yet the deeper impact remained in her spirit, where fear and trauma occasionally resurfaced in vivid flashes. Nightmares and anxiety episodes followed her into the weeks and months of recovery. Even so, there emerged within her a quiet determination to heal and to use her story as a cautionary tale. By sharing her experience, she hoped to educate others about the real dangers of wilderness exploration and the critical importance of respecting the boundaries between civilization and the wild. The morning on Kodiak Island began with a cold, biting wind that swept down from rugged mountains, carrying the salty scent of the sea and the faint rustle of waves against the rocky shore. Alex, a seasoned fisherman in his mid-50s, with weathered hands and a lifetime of experience reading the tides, was carefully reeling in his catch near a quiet cove. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he worked methodically, the smooth pull of the fishing line under his fingers a familiar and comforting rhythm. Nearby, a small pile of freshly caught salmon gleamed wet and silver on the jagged rocks, ready to be cleaned and packed for the journey home. Alex remained focused, fully aware of the dangers posed by the wild terrain, but confident in his skills and deep knowledge of the land he had fished for decades. Without warning, from the edge of the tree line beyond the rocks, a massive brown bear emerged almost silently, its large form blending into the shadows of the dense forest. The bear's dark eyes locked onto the salmon with sharp intent, its muscles rippling beneath a thick coat of fur as it moved forward with surprising speed. Alex's heart raced as he spotted the creature's approach. Before he could fully react, the bear lunged, snatching several of the gleaming fish with brutal efficiency. Its powerful jaws clamped down on the slippery bodies and dragged them away from the rocky shore. The sound of the sudden movement shattered the morning calm, and Alex reacted with a mixture of shock and alarm. Instinct took over as he raised his rifle, the cold metal steady in his grip despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. But the bear was not finished. Enraged by the disturbance and the attempted defense of its stolen meal, it charged with terrifying speed, crashing through branches and skidding over loose stones as it closed the distance. Alex barely had time to brace himself before the bear's massive paws struck, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling onto the uneven ground. Its claws slashed across his thigh with ferocious force, tearing deep into muscle and flesh and sending shockwaves of pain through his body. Blood welled quickly from the wound, soaking through the fabric of his pants and pooling on the rocky earth beneath him. Staggering back, Alex scrambled to his feet, gritting his teeth against the pain as he fired several warning shots into the air. The loud cracks of gunfire echoed sharply in the still morning, startling the bear momentarily and causing it to hesitate. Yet rather than retreating, the animal began to circle him with a deliberate, calculated patience. Its dark eyes remained locked on him, as if weighing the next move with intelligence and intent. The bear lunged again, once more crashing forward with incredible speed. It grazed Alex's outstretched arm, shredding the skin and sending him reeling sideways. Fighting to keep his balance, he battled against the pain and disorientation, his heart pounding wildly in his chest as he struggled to remain upright amid the chaos. With a final, powerful burst of motion, the bear turned and retreated toward the forest, carrying its stolen catch in its jaws as it vanished into the dense trees. Alex collapsed onto the rocks, trembling from the pain and adrenaline, his blood mixing with the cold sea spray while the wind howled around him. The wounds on his thigh and arm burned with intensity, and the weight of the encounter settled heavily over him. Though shaken and injured, he understood the urgency of acting quickly. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself upright and began a slow, painful trek back toward the small fishing village, located several miles inland. Every step was agonizing, but the thought of help and safety drove him forward along the rugged coastline. As he limped along, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs served as a reminder of the wilderness's relentless presence. His mind raced with memories of the attack, the bear's explosive charge, the slicing claws, the overwhelming scent of fur and earth mingled with blood. Deep down, Alex recognized that the bear's boldness was more than a random act. Environmental shifts were changing behavior. Scarcity of food in the unforgiving terrain was pushing these apex predators to take greater risks, drawing them dangerously close to human activity. By the time Alex reached the village, the close-knit community had sprung into action, rushing him to the nearest medical clinic. There, doctors cleaned and stitched his wounds, working for hours to stabilize his condition. The injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Recovery would be a long, painful process, but it was possible. The emotional impact, however, ran far deeper than the cuts on his body. Alex knew that what he had experienced was not just a personal ordeal. It was a clear warning sign about the changing nature of coexistence between humans and the wild. In response, local authorities and wildlife specialists issued urgent alerts to fishermen and outdoor workers in the region. They stressed the need for vigilance and preparedness, urging people to keep food securely stored and to avoid behaviors that could attract bears to populated areas. The message was stark and immediate. As these animals adapted to shrinking food resources and expanding human activity, close encounters were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming part of a troubling new pattern. Experts recommended deterrents such as bear spray and emphasized the importance of staying calm, backing away slowly, and avoiding eye contact in the presence of bears. They also advised against making sudden movements, noting that aggression often followed perceived threats. Education and preparation were now essential tools in avoiding tragedy. Despite these efforts, the community remained on edge, the attack a sobering reminder of how narrow the line was between survival and disaster in remote environments. The story quickly spread beyond the island, drawing attention to the broader challenges of wildlife management, habitat overlap, and human safety. For Alex, the memory of the bear's charge and the deep, burning pain of his injuries would never fully fade. Yet, through the trauma, he found the same quiet determination that had always guided him. There was no question that he would heal, and no doubt that he would return to the life he had built in the wild, more cautious, more aware, but still deeply connected to the land he had always called home. The Arctic fjords of a high northern region were cloaked in deep, biting cold as a group of friends moved steadily across a frozen shoreline, their snowboards cutting through pristine snow beneath a pale, gray sky. Wind whispered through jagged cliffs, carrying the faint scent of sea ice and salt that clung to the icy terrain. Among them, a man in his late 20s named Eric stood slightly apart, lean and observant, taking in the breathtaking but unforgiving beauty of the remote wilderness. The group had sought a day of adventure, drawn by the solitude and challenge of snowboarding in one of the world's most isolated environments. Their movements were fluid, their laughter quiet but genuine, filled with shared excitement and the silent trust built among people facing the elements together. What none of them noticed was the large figure silently moving through the distant tree line, concealed almost entirely by the snow and mist. A polar bear, driven by hunger and desperation due to dwindling access to its natural prey, had ventured closer to the shoreline than usual. Its thick white fur rendered it nearly invisible against the frozen backdrop, and its heavy paws moved with a silence that defied its massive size. As Eric adjusted his stance and prepared for the next descent, his focus was elsewhere, unaware of the danger closing in. Suddenly, the bear charged. The quiet of the Arctic morning was shattered by the thunderous force of its sprint. Eric had only a fraction of a second to register the movement before the animal collided with him, knocking him violently to the frozen ground. The sheer impact stunned him, the cold surface beneath his body cracking and shifting beneath the weight of the collision. The others turned at the sound, their moment of joy ripped apart by the chaos now unfolding only yards away. The predator attacked with unrelenting force, its jaws closing on Eric with primal precision. The weight of the animal pressed the air from his lungs as it struck again and again. The cold wind faded into the background as pain and shock overtook him, and the snow beneath turned dark with blood. Eric struggled, driven by instinct, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. Its claws and teeth tore into him with terrifying efficiency, leaving him broken and battered in moments. The others, frozen by fear but driven by the will to act, scrambled into motion. Some fired emergency flares into the air, hoping the noise and sudden bursts of light would disrupt the attack. Others shouted and struck rocks together, using sound and movement to create confusion. For a brief moment, the bear hesitated, its eyes flicking toward the chaos erupting nearby. But hunger and instinct prevailed. The attack resumed with a final surge before the animal turned and began to retreat. Slowly, the bear moved back into the tree line, its massive form fading into the snow and fog until it was once again part of the Arctic stillness. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Eric lay motionless on the ground, the snow around him disturbed and stained by the violence of the encounter. His friends gathered quickly, their faces pale with shock, doing what they could to keep him warm and responsive while sending out emergency signals. Rescue crews arrived swiftly, guided by the flares and distress calls. Eric was transported by emergency team to the nearest medical station, but the damage had been too severe. Despite their best efforts, his injuries proved fatal. His life ended quietly in the cold, a tragic reminder of the risks hidden within the stark beauty of the far north. The incident sent waves of shock through nearby communities, where life was always shaped by the rhythms and risks of the wilderness. Though devastating, the attack was not an isolated occurrence. In recent years, polar bears had increasingly come into contact with humans, their habitats shrinking and traditional food sources vanishing due to rapid environmental changes. Wildlife specialists responded with urgency, emphasizing that encounters like this were becoming more frequent and more dangerous. Authorities issued immediate warnings, encouraging travelers and explorers to take greater precautions when entering polar bear territory. New safety guidelines were implemented. Travel in groups, carry deterrent devices, maintain constant vigilance, and avoid known wildlife corridors. Local leaders also called for improved infrastructure to support both human safety and wildlife conservation, advocating for long-term solutions that could help reduce these tragic confrontations. The public response was one of grief, reflection, and reevaluation. Adventurers reconsidered the allure of the untamed, weighing the risks more seriously. Eric was remembered with love and respect, a young man drawn to the wild not out of recklessness, but out of admiration for its grandeur and challenge. His death became a solemn emblem of the fragile line between awe and danger, between human ambition and natural force. For those who had witnessed the event firsthand, the experience left a lasting mark. The sound of the bear's movements, the sight of Eric beneath it, the chaotic scramble to intervene, all lingered long after the snow was undisturbed again. In the weeks that followed, memorials were held and stories were shared. Eric's legacy became more than the story of a tragic accident. It became a catalyst for awareness. His death highlighted the urgent need for coexistence strategies that respect both human life and the needs of vulnerable wildlife. As climate change continues to shift the balance of remote ecosystems, such encounters may grow more common. Yet with awareness, education, and planning, the goal remains to prevent such tragedies, honoring both the people who venture into the wild and the animals struggling to survive within it. The bitter cold of a Pacific Northwest winter had settled deep into the forest, coating the trees and ground with heavy snow that muffled footsteps and muted the usual sounds of wildlife. In a remote ranger station, nestled between towering pines and rugged hills, the quiet was broken only by the creak of wood settling and the occasional whistle of wind through the gaps in the old building's weathered walls. The station, a modest structure meant to serve as a temporary shelter and base for rangers patrolling the area, stood vulnerable against the harsh season, its sturdy doors and windows offering the only protection from the relentless cold and wild creatures lurking just beyond the tree line. Inside, the kitchen held the promise of warmth and sustenance, stocked with canned goods, dried food, and small supplies brought in from the nearest town. Food was carefully rationed in this isolated outpost, but the harsh winter had made even the smallest stores a beacon for desperate animals driven by hunger. A black bear, large and powerful, had been roaming the forest edges for days, drawn ever closer by the scent of the rations stored in the station. It was a mature male, its thick fur matted and dull from cold and hunger, its eyes sharp with growing desperation. Hunger had pushed it beyond normal caution, eroding the natural fear of humans that once kept such creatures at a distance. One bitter night, when the wind outside was lashing snow against the windows, the bear found the back door of the ranger station left slightly ajar, a rare but critical mistake made during a hurried exit earlier in the day. Without hesitation, the bear forced its massive body through the narrow opening, the wooden frame splintering under its weight and claws. Inside, the bear's powerful paws tore through the kitchen, scattering cans and boxes in a chaotic mess as it sought food with frantic energy. The air filled with the harsh smell of crushed metal and spilled food, the sound of destruction echoing in the cramped space. The animal's desperation was clear. It gnawed at cans, pawed frantically through shelves, and overturned containers in search of nourishment. Every movement sent sharp splinters of wood and metal crashing to the floor, and the heavy scent of animal musk mixed with the stale air inside. For a long moment, the bear's attention was consumed by the feast it had found, unaware that its intrusion was about to be interrupted. A ranger, returning unexpectedly from a late patrol, approached the station through the snow, his boots crunching loudly despite the drifting flakes. The sudden noise startled the bear, which turned quickly, revealing its full size and ferocity to the man who stood frozen near the threshold. The ranger, a seasoned man in his 40s, strong, experienced, and accustomed to the wilderness, felt a surge of adrenaline at the shock of the encounter. Cornered and frantic, the bear reacted with aggressive speed. It lunged, jaws snapping, and clamped down hard on the ranger's forearm, crushing flesh and bone with terrifying force. The man was knocked to the ground with a heavy thud, the snow beneath him rapidly stained dark with blood. Pain exploded through his arm, but he fought back with everything he had. Years of training and field work kicked in, driving him to resist the panic threatening to consume him. Scrambling to reach the nearest object, a heavy metal lamp from a nearby table, he swung it with brutal force at the bear's snarling face. The lamp shattered against thick fur and bone, causing the animal to recoil for a split second. The ranger, summoning every ounce of strength, responded with a commanding roar, hoping to startle the animal with noise and movement. The bear's eyes burned with fury as it swiped again with massive claws, raking across the man's chest and sending shards of wood and blood into the air. The attack was violent and overwhelming. But within moments, the chaos shifted. Another ranger, the man's partner, arrived after hearing the commotion from outside. Younger but calm and capable, he sprang into action with practiced precision. From just inside the doorway, he deployed a thick cloud of bear spray, aiming directly at the animal's face. The burning chemical hit its mark, forcing the bear to stagger backward, snarling and blinking furiously. Acting swiftly, the partner fired several warning shots into the air. The sharp, echoing blasts split the night and amplified the confusion. Disoriented, the bear lashed out one final time, its claws grazing the wounded ranger's side before retreating. With heavy footsteps, it vanished into the snow-covered trees, leaving behind a trail of blood, wreckage, and lingering fear. The two rangers moved quickly to assess the damage. The injuries were severe but not fatal. The bite wound to the forearm was deep and would require urgent medical attention. Still, the man's resilience, combined with fast action and teamwork, had likely saved his life. News of the encounter spread quickly throughout the local forestry service and surrounding communities. The event served as a sobering reminder of the rising boldness among wildlife, especially black bears, as food scarcity and harsh winters drove them further into human-occupied territory. In the aftermath, safety protocols across ranger stations in the region were reviewed and tightened. Extra precautions were mandated, including the reinforcement of door and window locks, additional training on emergency animal deterrence, and clear directives about never leaving any point of entry unsecured. The urgency of preparing for winter-related wildlife encounters was underscored by this near-tragic incident. Patrols were increased at night, and rangers were issued more advanced deterrent tools. Discussions among wildlife experts and conservation organizations intensified, focusing on the complex relationship between environmental pressures and animal behavior. The shrinking availability of natural food sources, driven by habitat loss and climate-related shifts, had led to more unpredictable and dangerous patterns in wildlife movement and aggression. These were not merely isolated incidents, but part of a broader trend demanding coordinated responses from multiple stakeholders. Balancing the need to protect vulnerable animal populations with the necessity of ensuring human safety became a more pressing issue. Solutions required public education, changes in wilderness management, and strategies for coexisting with wildlife without compromising the integrity of natural spaces or endangering lives. As for the wounded ranger, the experience left lasting marks. The physical recovery was slow and painful, complicated by torn muscle and shattered bone, but the deeper wounds were emotional. The memory of the bear's raw power, the surprise of the attack, and the razor-thin margin between life and death. Even so, he remained steadfast in his purpose. Though shaken, his dedication to the forest, to his work, and to the animals themselves endured. His survival became a quiet symbol among his peers, of strength, clarity under pressure, and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. For those who spend their lives in these remote places, the event stood as a visceral example of what it truly means to coexist with the wild. Not in dominance, not in conquest, but with vigilance, respect, and a hard-earned understanding that nature, in all its beauty and brutality, follows no script.